Welcome to another episode of the Brewtally Speaking Podcast, the official podcast of MetalNexus.net, where you can get all your news, show reviews, and so much more. So head on over to MetalNexus.net. And with me, as always, is my co-host, Daniel Terry. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing great, man. Got some crazy wind going on down here in the Midwest.
Yeah, I think we have something called a cyclone bomb or something that's happening.
Yeah, I don't know about all that shit, but I do know that that stuff started flying off at the top of my roof. Pretty much, well, assuming the roof is at the top of my house, like most people. But yeah, I got some shingles missing. I got some stuff turned over. But when you're talking about like cyclone bomb, I mean, what does that entail exactly? Like,
I have no idea. I don't know.
You need to go to a shelter or
no?
What's
no.
the deal?
I guess it's just like super, super strong winds and weather. I don't know.
Okay, all right.
It's just a term they've been throwing around, and I don't know. I'm just gonna stay home and drink beer. So,
Sounds good.
The guest this episode though is Michael Beinhorn, a legendary producer. Something I think that's kind of fun, you know, with Dan's show discography discussion and this show. I don't know if like anybody else gets excited to talk about the people who made the records that you've loved for so long, but it's always great to me to be able to get producers on and just kind of get like the real behind the scenes kind of stuff on some of your favorite classic records.
Right, because the musicians half the time don't remember like anything about the actual recording, or they'll remember stuff, but like it's almost like an unrealistic or a idealized view of what was it like working with that producer? Oh, it was great. You never get to hear the other side of it where the producer's like, these guys showed up, they didn't have anything written down. And I mean, it's wasting their money, but you know, at 5 o'clock, I'm going home because my work day's over, you know, that sort of stuff. And that wasn't really this conversation here, but that is one of the reasons I like talking to producers so much, because you kind of get a more realistic everyman approach to like, this is my job and this is how these people acted versus, you know, how I acted and all that. And I find that to be a lot more fun sometimes than hearing it from the musician who's usually just going to give you a one-word answer like, oh, it's wonderful. Working with him was great.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at someone, it's almost like the same issue I had when I had Steve Evans on. The dude has done, and speaking to Michael and Steve, they've done so much prolific work that touches and spans so many genres and decades that it's like you're almost like overwhelmed with like, well, where do I start?
Right.
And so I with this one, I kind of kept it to 4 records that I wanted to talk about. And the whole reason Michael even, you know, was coming on is because he started a new platform business, basically where he is reaching out or has the ability to have musicians or songwriters come to him and work on pre-production and songwriting, which is something that he takes very serious and I think kind of shows in all the records that he's worked on. I mean, you look at some of the, Soundgarden, Super Unknown. I mean, Jesus Christ, those songs like are great, and a lot of that is the band. But I mean, it's also, you know, like when we talked about Coma White off of the Mechnical Animals record. You know, the fact that he knew how to approach it from a production standpoint to really make it about the song and bring out the song as best as he could without either adding too much and just destroying it or making it too simple and not making it be the best that it could be. And I always think stories like that are just so interesting because it's like, I don't think a lot of us realize, like, you can add too much and then it just loses all sense of where the song, like what the song is and why it's great just in its bare bones. And I thought that was a really fun story. I haven't decided if I'm going to leave in the part where I fucked up on that John 5 wasn't actually on that record.
Yeah, leave it in. Leave it in.
Speaking of leaving it in,
we're human beings. Yes,
we are, and human beings love beer. And currently, I have the last of my Rochester Mills Lush Milkshake IPA. Last episode I talked about the Perrin Brewing IPA, and you know, a lot of times IPAs are really interesting. I either have a love-hate with them where they're really good or I'm not a fan of them. And the 98 Problems from Perrin was one that I just kind of was about, but the Milkshake IPA, it's really good. So Rochester Mills though is kind of most known for their Milkshake Stout, which is obviously why they have the Milkshake IPA. But they do a lot of fun flavors within the Milkshake Stout family. Like, they have a barrel-aged toasted marshmallow milkshake stout. They have an oatmeal milkshake stout, a blueberry pancake milkshake stout, which is absolutely phenomenal. They have coffee ones, they have peanut butter, they have German chocolate cake, English toffee, chocolate cheesecake, turtle. Like they just, and every Christmas time they do the 12 milkshakes at Christmas, and they do like a seasonal pack. But they do so phenomenal. I love milkshake stouts from Rochester Mills. So if you ever come across one, check it out. This Lush Milkshake IPA is really good. Definitely recommend it. And Dan, what are you drinking?
Yeah, so I've been drinking a lot of Divided Sky, which is a rye IPA made by Four Hands Brewing Company here in good old St. Louis of Missouri. And they are kind of killing it in our local scene right now. They are the best craft beer company that we have, I think. Well, that's not true. That's probably narrow gauge, but their beers cost like $8 per can. So, I love them, but I can't afford them. I'm not high class enough. So for poor people like me, Four Hands is where you go. And the Divided Sky rye IPA is like an even more harsh IPA than what I'm used to drinking, which people that know me know that that's going to be pretty harsh. It's very, very, very dry. And you really have to be in the right mood for it. But I really like eating it with spicy tacos.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and that is, it's like a perfect combination for me.
My old roommate and I, well, mainly him, made a jalapeno beer. And to drink it was kind of not good. But when you're eating chips and salsa, it was the perfect beer to wash that down with.
That's awesome. Yeah, I find that too with more bitter beers. I don't know what it is. Like, I don't like when, like, I can't understand how people will eat like Mexican food and wash it down with a soda. Like, that just disgusts me. It's not because I'm a snob. I just don't understand how you can go from spicy to sweet like that.
Well, I mean, that's the spice of life.
It's weird though, and it's maybe just weird to me personally. To me, I have to have some kind of just more bitter tasting liquid that will cool my tongue, but also kind of keep my palate good.
Right. And speaking to a veritable palate, let's get to my conversation with Michael Beinhorn, and we'll talk to you guys later. So I have the pleasure this early afternoon of talking with Michael Beinhorn, producer extraordinaire, has basically recorded most of some of the seminal albums of my youth, and probably yours if you're listening. How are you doing today, Michael?
I'm wonderful, thanks.
So something, I've had a few producers on, and it's always kind of fun because while I'm not a producer and I have no real understanding of how any of that works, I do tend to find that some producers just make records and there's just something and an intangible about them and the work that they do and what they're able to get out of the artists that I've grown to love. And you have definitely done that over your decades-long career. So I'd like
Thank you.
So I'd like to go through some of the records with you because the whole reason you're actually on is you just launched a workshop of sorts where musicians can come to you to work on pre-production, songwriting, and so forth, because I know that is something that you are very big on when working with various musicians, is that. So with that being said, I kind of wanted to start with OZZmosis, Ozzy Osbourne's record. It's no secret that basically Ozzy, quote-unquote, writes all the music. Well, that's how it's been put on a lot of the records, and anyone who understands why we're laughing is in on the joke. But with that being said, I can think that it's one of the few records actually in Ozzy's solo career where he actually listed a lot of the people that were on the record, and it was one of the first to have Geezer, actually I think the only record to have Geezer Butler actually on it. So I kind of wanted to know, with your hand in wanting to, make some of the best songs with the people you're working with, what was it like working on that OZZmosis record with Geezer, with Zakk Wylde and Steve Vai for a little bit?
Well, it obviously, since you include Steve in there, like it really it spanned a pretty long amount of time, because the project started with Vai as the guitarist. And it kind of evolved into Steve not being the guitarist and getting Zakk back in the band, which I always felt very strongly was sort of like the best way to go. And I think there'd been talk about having Geezer play on the record, and I just felt that it would be really important to bridge any kind of gap that had been created in Ozzy's Ozzy's recording career by having at least one other member of Sabbath on that record. And that's one of the main reasons that Geezer was. I mean, apart from the fact that his personality really comes through in his playing, and he's just such a wonderful. He's a great personality to have in the studio. His contribution was fantastic on that record. And once the band was established, and once the foundation of the record, the songs were actually together, it was, it definitely took a long time to record, but I think in the end it was worth the effort.
Because if my memory serves me correctly, OZZmosis was around the time of Ozzy saying he was going to retire. And then basically, here we are. Let's see. So it was No More Tears because it was the No More Tours tour initially, and I think that was like 91. So by the time you're doing OZZmosis, like, was there a reinvigoration with Ozzy himself and the band? Because now all of a sudden they have like a second life, it seems, not calling it quits.
I would refer to it as kind of a hard reboot or something. To which you can ascribe whatever characteristics you'd like. Yeah, but I think the necessity was there, and I from that point, again, I think it was just a matter of having the right component parts in the mix, which again is why it was so important to have Geezer and Zach performing on that record. It was a very interesting and time-consuming and rigorous process, but that's showbiz.
Yeah. Something else too that I thought was kind of interesting in looking back on OZZmosis, and we'll kind of talk about this a little bit. Was this the first time you had worked with drummer Dean Castronova?
It was, yeah.
Okay. Because something that I thought was kind of interesting in looking at a lot of the records you have done is the fact that it seems like you kind of are almost a magnet for records that kind of have a little bit of turmoil, kind of have people coming in and out and creating, really beautiful music as a result of kind of the craziness, it seems, of the surrounding components, we'll say.
Or hopefully in spite of. It's funny because I think at one point I kind of got a reputation for being a guy who could work with people who were a little bit unskewed. But be that as it may, I mean, that was my first record with Dean. It was interesting because Dean was technically and is technically an extraordinary drummer, but he started out by just overplaying like crazy, and we had to work on that. Then when we went into tracking, he just kind of froze up, and it got kind of fraught there for a minute. But we had a talk, and he somehow came from behind to absolutely captivate everyone with his performances on the record, and I recognized what a fantastic musician he was. And after that, because he put so much ferocity and raw power into his playing, as well as being such an amazing technician, and he could play with feel, which is very important because not a lot of drummers can. And I worked with him on a bunch of other records as a result of that, and his performance definitely bears itself out.
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, drumming is kind of one of those things for me that I typically tend to find myself gravitating toward initially when I listen to a record, just because, I mean, it's the backbone of a band. So at that point, if you have a really great, tight sounding drum kit, then I think the rest will kind of fall into place since it's kind of what everyone goes off of. I kind of wanted to talk a little bit too. I know this has been kind of probably beaten to death for you because it's of how landmark it was, these two records coming back to back for you. But I couldn't think of really, honestly, two different examples of bands and personalities maybe you could have worked with. But whole Celebrity Skin, and that's kind of why I asked about working with Dean, because there was a little bit of
He played on that.
yeah, there's a little bit of some tension, I guess, that came as a result of having Dean come on and record the drums on this record. And something I kind of wanted to know about that is, throughout your career, like if you are listening to a band during the pre-production phase, if something doesn't sound right, will you kind of go to the players themselves and be like, hey, I think you need to kind of tighten this up, or you need to get a little bit better? Or, in some instances, like, I've heard, I think it was Toby Wright will flat out tell people sometimes, like, you're not good enough to do this, so I'm going to get someone who can, so we're not wasting everyone's time. Like, do you go to that approach with it?
It really depends on the people involved. Every project's different, so I don't apply like a one-size-fits-all approach to the process. On whole, we really kind of started the project with the understanding. It was interesting because they already knew that I'd worked on a bunch of projects where we had to replace the drummer. And one of the first things that they said to me was, we want you to produce this record on the condition that you do not fire our drummer. Interesting, isn't it, considering what wound up happening? And I was like, okay, well, we'll just make it work somehow, and we proceeded to do just that. And I was under the impression when we were in rehearsals that this wasn't going to be an easy project as far as recording drums, but that we were going to do it because I felt that the drummer was really trying very, very hard. We rehearsed for about a month and a half in SIR because we didn't, we needed to nail down the songs because they weren't all completely finished or arranged. But also I wanted to work with her directly because I wanted to make sure if I'd been tasked to ensure that she was going to play on the record, that she actually had the opportunity to do so. And then, by the end of the rehearsals, I was pretty convinced that we were going to be okay. But when we got into the studio, she began to choke. And worse than that, she began to forget her parts.
Oh, wow.
Which was really strange to me. Yeah, because she'd been pretty consistent in rehearsals, and I really was doing a lot of cheerleading at that point. So, it was very upsetting to watch the whole thing happen. But I couldn't do anything about it because the band had actually said you can't fire her. So, it took a long time. And finally I went to after 3 weeks of trying to record drums, mind you, I went to the band and initially told them about it. And they were like, we already had this conversation. And after another week and a half, one of them came in and heard some of the drum tracks, and they sort of recoiled in horror. And I was like, "What? Those are the drums?" And they're like, "Oh, that's it. Time for a new drummer." And I was like, "Okay." But Dean came in. We had a little difficulty with him initially too, but he actually did the entire record in about 3-4 days, I think. He cut the whole thing. But the thing is that when you're dealing with a musician at that level, and that is what a drummer should be able to do. In the old days, when you would bring in session players, or when you had drummers, period, in your band, they were completely acclimatized to the kind of music that you were recording. And when you got a session drummer, it wasn't just some guy who could keep time. It was a guy who played a specific style. So each session drummer had his sort of milieu that he would get hired to do. Like you wouldn't get a guy like Leon Chancellor, even though I'm sure he could have done this and put him on a rock record.
Right.
Same way you wouldn't get a guy like Mickey Curry and have him play on a Michael Jackson record. It was just different styles of music. Or Ziggy Modaliste, who is the drummer from the Meters. Like people weren't hiring him to do rock records. Nowadays, you might think twice about it just because, a good drummer to a lot of people is a good drummer, but it really wasn't always like that. Like the drummer had to fit the mood and the character of the music. And, but that's generally, as far as a band person, what you want, someone who kind of evokes the characteristic of the band and to a lesser degree the style of music that they do, but is capable of being able to do that. And if you're dealing with people like that, if you're dealing with musicians on a project who aren't holding up their end of things, yeah, they need scrutiny. And I'm not necessarily going to go to them off the bat and say, hey, you're out of here. I know a lot of people who do, but it's, I always have to consider, well, what's the aftermath of this? Like, I have a responsibility to the project, but I also have to look at how these people are going to be able to maintain a relationship once this is over. Not everyone can. Actually, most people can't handle that kind of rejection, especially when they've been, when their position has been cemented for so long. So, you really have to think very carefully, or at least I feel I do, about those things before, rushing in and just saying, okay, you're out of here.
Right. It is kind of a bit weird that they put the caveat on the fact that, like, you can't get rid of our drummer. Almost like even they maybe had some trepidations on whether they would, she would be able to perform up to the level of the music that, would needed to be on record.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's fun. It's interesting because they were hiring a person who already had a reputation for doing things like that. But the odd thing is that that was kind of a thing that a lot of producers were doing or had experience in. Like, in fact, there were some guys who would just come in and look at the drummer and just say, right, you're out of here. They wouldn't even listen to him play. They would just be like, I'm bringing my guy in. That's the end of the story. We're not even having a conversation about it. Which, again, is like, I think that at a certain level, at least back in those days, if you were the drummer, you kind of took that one with a grain of salt, because you kind of like, being in a band wasn't kind of like, didn't have the same kind of camaraderie that it's meant to have. It was more of like this is more of a business proposition now. Like, if I'm not playing on my own record, that's fine. It's not great for me. Like, it's not good for my ego, but I'm going to deal with it because I'm going to go out on the road with these guys anyway, and I'm going to get paid like, hundreds of thousands, probably millions of dollars. So it doesn't really make any difference. It just means in this case, I can leave the studio and go to like the strip clubs for like the next few weeks and then go home, which is what a lot of guys did if you were recording back in Vancouver, back in those days. But that's like that was a whole different approach to making records as well, where it was really sort of like a very corporate thing. Mm-hmm. And, the band sort of everyone was operating based on one individual's leadership. It definitely wasn't a democracy.
Right.
And, whatever he said went, and everyone went along with it because they were enjoying the amounts of money that they were making, and that was more important to them than anything, even getting their egos bruised.
As I'm kind of thinking about this record and some of the songs off of this record, what was it? I think a couple of years ago, there was that nice viral video of Courtney Love, and it was always tagged with the "Don't piss off the sound guy before you go play," and then it's a video, supposedly, of her playing Celebrity Skin, and it just the vocals and the guitar playing just being super sloppy. And so it kind of made me wonder, like, if you had seen that, and if you did, if you're like, well, that's not how, that's obviously doctored audio, whatever, because, I was there when she did all these things, and I know, obviously, like, that's not how she plays. Because I've never really seen an individual get lambasted so badly like that for playing, but then accrediting it almost to, well, if you're kind of a shitty person and treat your crew like shit, this is what happens. Like, they have the ultimate say over how you can sound to everybody else that pays money to see you and the public perception of you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I saw that it was out there, and I opted not to because, for one thing, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't do anything for me to see someone, ripped apart like that. I mean, Courtney has thrust herself into the limelight at various times in her life in ways that perhaps weren't very helpful to her. But I think anyone who's studied her career already knows about all that stuff, and it's just kind of it's a very exploitative way to kind of, I guess, to have fun at someone else's expense. I mean, someone could have just as easily called the video, I feel like making fun of Courtney Love, so here you go.
Right.
I don't know how she treated her crew on the road or anything else like that, so I can't really speak to that.
I just thought it was interesting that it's like typically the techs and crew like that, your sound engineers and your lighting people and all that are like most people don't know those people exist as far as when you're on a tour or anything like that. So it was really interesting to see so many people sharing the video, and I know most of it was more like, look at this person that we all hold in high regard, being like not being as good as we think she is. Ha ha ha. But it's like, to me, it's like, well, actually, it kind of does speak more to the fact that it's like there are people who make a living doing ancillary things for a band. So, I mean, if that was the situation of that video, then kudos to the fact that maybe it's exposing more people to be like, hey, by the way, don't be shitty to people. Like, because that gets you nowhere.
I wish that was the case. I think by and large videos like that just sort of promote this idea of taking famous people down a few pegs, which you can't help it, but there have been recordings like that out there for years. I mean, there's a very famous one that someone was doing a live record for the Stones, and they managed to isolate Mick Jagger's voice and Ron Wood's guitar, and the resulting bootleg just kind of made it all over the world. I did wind up with a copy of that one, and it's pretty appalling. But you're talking about a bunch of guys who are playing a show in front of hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, who's to say what's gonna go on? It's that kind of stuff I think it tends to be more sort of a way to mock other people. I don't think anyone's really thinking about the sound man or anyone else, which, I mean, I hate to put it like that.
No, for sure.
It's just a different perspective on it, I think. I don't think the culture allows for people to kind of like to look at a video like that or listen to a piece of music like that and go, wow, maybe they should have been a little bit nicer. Those guys are working hard back there.
Well, I think it's kind of funny because, like, when I go to a lot of live shows, not obviously to you, but in general, and something I always kind of pay attention to is just the sound, and I've gone from being that person who used to be up front to then being now the guy who hangs back by the soundboard, because it's like, well, that's where the sound is being mixed from, so obviously it stands to reason that that's going to be where the best sound is coming from, is right where the person mixing everything is. But even I have kind of noticed there's so many variables, different gear people aren't used to using. If you are, if you're an out of country band performing, whether you're, from overseas coming here to the US or US overseas, maybe you're not playing on the gear that's actually yours, you're renting gear. And there's so many variables, like you say. So a lot of times I'm a little bit more forgiving now of when something isn't going right, plus just the regular stresses of tour and the fatigue and so forth that can set in. So it's like, sometimes you may not get a band on their best night, and that's okay. Like, that's why you go see them more than one time.
Yeah, exactly. And everyone is working really, really hard. You're absolutely right. It's a very tough job.
Is that something that you have done in your career? Have you ever gone on tour with a band and done live sound for them?
I was kind of that guy on stage. I've never done sound like that. I have gone on tour minimally, and it was just one of those, it wasn't my thing type deals. I wasn't really that into it. I mean, it was interesting. It was fun to kind of like, to travel a little bit, but above and beyond that, I found that my true calling lay elsewhere.
Speaking of elsewhere, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about one of my favorite Manson albums, but one that is so unlike all the rest to me. Mechnical Animals, obviously. This record is really interesting, and something I kind of wanted to, once I knew that I was going to be talking to you, and I know that you're a stickler for pre-production and getting in there with the bands and really making the songs the best that they can be. If memory serves me correctly, when this record was coming out, you came into this when the record was kind of already being worked on. Like you weren't there from pre-production phase all the way through. You came in due to being on that whole record. It sounds like once the initial recording process had already started. Is that correct?
No, actually, they demoed most of the songs for the record, save one. And when I came, I think they'd already scrapped a partly recorded version of it. I'm not really sure,
the record that they were doing with the Dust Brothers, supposedly.
Yeah, that's right. And there was one other guy whose name, who I know, but I don't remember his name. Partly because I'm sleep deprived. No, mainly because I'm sleep deprived. But we did that record from the ground up, and I didn't need to do a massive amount of pre-production, but we did do 2 weeks.
Okay.
Because some of the songs definitely needed some trimming. The essence of the record was there, but it definitely it still had a little bit of fat on it. It wasn't as tight as it could have been. So we spent some time, and also working up like a final song, which wound up being "I Don't Like the Drugs." And then we went into the studio and started recording it. But that whole thing was done from the ground up.
It's been kind of interesting. The 3 records so far that we've talked about, you've worked with some rather large personalities as the leads of the band, between Ozzy himself, Courtney Love, and now Mr. Marilyn Manson. The thing that is kind of interesting about this is, like, this record specifically is, I know John 5 is on it, but I feel like he is on it the way that a lot of John 5 tracks are that he's on, where it's so kind of understated that it really shows to the brilliance of how well he can play for a song. Because if anyone who knows John 5 knows that dude just rips. So the fact that he's able to be so nuanced and play songs like the stuff on this album, it's very interesting to know that he's a part of this record. What was it like working with John on this record?
I'm sorry. I think it's. I just like the way you said that. I think his playing is so nuanced because he's actually not on the record.
Was it? Well, he's credited. I know it's credited as live guitar. I always took that as, like when sometimes you do, like bands sometimes when they record, they'll do like a live recording for certain parts, like where the whole band kind of gets together in a room. So I always took it as the credit in the liner notes that the live guitar meant that John was playing kind of live guitar in that sense, not necessarily like basically just a live guitarist playing like live in the room, more or less.
I keep forgetting because people keep reminding me that he's actually credited on the record, but he didn't. I don't think he was even. I don't think I actually ever even met him. I don't know. But he didn't play on the record. It's all Twiggy basically.
Okay. Well, I guess that would explain why it doesn't sound like anything that he's really ever done that I've heard, because he's not on it. But yeah, that's where the production credits get kind of weird.
Yeah, I hope that you don't think I was mocking you.
No, not at all.
I just like that you said nuance, and I was like, well, you can't get any more. I was thinking you can't get any more nuance than not even being there.
No, for sure. Well, I was just gonna say, I think a lot of people, like from his time working with like Katie Lang to some of the stuff he's done with like Rod Stewart and so forth, it's like there's projects and songs that he's been a part of that if you listen to it, you would be like, I don't really hear much guitar, or guitar in the way that I would assume when you say John 5 plays like in like he did play on some of the Manson stuff, or even Rob Zombie or his solo stuff. It's like if you go into it expecting that with the stuff he's done with other players and other musicians, I think it really showcases, and that's kind of what I was bringing out more, is that he's able to play for the song. So that's why I always thought it was interesting in the sense of it being credited as a live guitar credit, that I was thinking that he's basically coming in doing real like kind of live guitar tracks like live in the room, and And it was just like,
I
even
understand.
listening to it, I'd never really heard anything where I was like, okay, I think that's him, because it just never sounded like him. So, I mean, you basically
Right.
were able to clarify something I've long wondered and just never really known.
Good.
So I'll take that as a learning experience.
I'm
The
glad.
the other thing that was kind of interesting about this record to me is just the sheer amount of ancillary players that come into play. I know, like, at one point, like you were saying, "Don't Like the Drugs" has just a slew of people on this song. Between and maybe I'm wrong on this. I know Dave Navarro apparently was in on the recording sessions, I think, for this song, as
Yeah,
well
he was.
as well as Rose McGowan. I think since Manson and her were dating at this time, I think ended up on the record as well.
Yeah, she did like a little something on one of the songs. I cannot remember which one for the life of me, though. Yeah, we definitely had some interesting guests on that record.
What was the overall vibe of recording that like? Because I think the thing that's always intrigued me is when it comes to recording, and I could be completely wrong, because back then we weren't privy to all the behind the scenes footage rolling out on YouTube as part of the pre-release for a record coming out and so forth. But with that being said, it always seems like once it got time to record a record, the it was very serious. It always seemed like it was a very serious, focused effort whenever Manson and the band would go in to record. Was that the case, or was it kind of a little more? I don't know if debaucherous is the word I'm looking for. I'm definitely going to use that on one of the next things I talk about.
Yeah. Not really. I mean, it kind of vacillated. It was a very mercurial process, actually. I mean, there were a couple of moments that could have, I think you could say, crossed into that territory. But for the most part, when he was working, it was when he came into the studio, most of the time he was ready to work, which I appreciated. He definitely had a very good work ethic. Once in a while, that would kind of tarnish. It would fade away a little bit, and it would sort of metamorphose into something other. It could go from being very irritating to very silly. But everyone was pretty ready for it. As far as the guys in the band, generally speaking, they were they were ready to go too. I mean, Pogo had all his parts worked out. Twiggy was an excellent musician, so he just came in and nailed pretty much everything. And it actually didn't take that long to make the record. It was about 2.5 months from start to finish. So we were working, moderately fast. And Manson could use his voice for very long periods of time, which is nice. He doesn't sing very loud when he sings. He just sings very close into the microphone. He works hard not to strain his voice too hard, even though he does do a lot of what sounds like screaming. Right. It was, but it was interesting. It was a very interesting process. At times it was a lot of fun, because there were some really wonderful moments. There were some moments where, I felt like we really captured something very, very powerful and very interesting and unique. And that's something that makes record making for me, the best job imaginable, because you have these moments of utter inspiration. And not only are you being inspired by it, but you're in the process of making what's happening. So it's kind of like this instantaneous feedback loop, and it's just so wonderful to be a part of that whole thing. It really is. There's nothing like it.
One of my favorite songs of Manson's, and it's actually the album closer, Coma White. What was, because to me, I always feel like that, and I'm probably way off, but I always feel like that to me was like a song that I feel like someone was just kind of doodling around on the guitar, came up with that like little bit of that little run, and then basically, like someone like Manson maybe goes, "Hey, wait, do that again," and then quickly like inspiration strikes, and here is a song kind of thrown together rather quickly. I'm probably way off. I'm sure it was like something that already came and was already done, but that song just has a vibe to it that I can't really put my finger on it. It's so many things all in one. What do you remember about recording that song specifically?
It was another one, I would have to say, of a lot of songs that I felt were really powerful on that record. That's the one thing about that record that I really love, is that I feel it stands out from a lot of his work because there's so much of like a heavy sort of, gothic metal, sort of dark kind of influence to a lot of his stuff. But this record is really, it was a lot more nuanced, and there was a lot more depth to it, I felt. Mm-hmm. That's not to take away anything from any of his other work, but there was just something about this that was really, it wasn't quite so black and white. There were a lot of shades of gray to it, and Coma White definitely stood out as one of those songs. Like it had a really, really, like a very palpable emotional power to it. A lot of people really love that song, and I have to say it's also one of my favorites as well. It's actually it's quite beautiful, and the lyrics are, there's some of them are actually really profound. Mm-hmm. And instead of like this kind of angry sort of like teeth gnashing type of anthemic type thing, this song is there's almost a sense of resignation about it, like sadness, which is something that you don't really get from a lot of his music, but it comes across so beautifully on that song. And yeah, that's one reason I loved it. And, I felt that adding a kind of latent sense of brutality to it, like in the drums, the bass tones, mm-hmm. some of the instrument sounds, without taking away from and enhancing that sense of sadness, was really paramount. So that was really what I tried to achieve on that.
Well, I think you definitely captured the sense of melancholy that is just throughout that whole song to me.
Thank you. Yeah, it's you feel it too, right? It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's very haunting. It's almost like something that, and I remember when a friend wanted me to cover it with him, and I was like, there's just something about this song that you almost can't, because when you hear it, there's just something about it that just seeps through you and goes all the way into your bones and becomes kind of this thing that won't go away. And like, you can't quite put your finger on it, but like, that if you really pay attention to everything, like, there's just no way you can't be moved by it. And I think that's the thing, that it's very understated in a sense, but there's, like I said, there's just so much, like you were saying with the production side of things, there's so much nuance to that song as well, that it seems like so much could have gone so wrong if you chose to do like the drum, maybe mix the drums a little differently or mix the song a little bit differently, and the whole vibe of it would be completely lost, I think. And I think that's something that's always amazed me too about records from a production standpoint sometimes, is knowing when it's good as it is or changing it to make it become better.
Well, I think at its best, music production isn't just a matter of trying to make something sound good or great. It's also a way of enhancing the art of the artist. My job, I feel, is always, as a producer, to help bring out aspects, even aspects that are latent in the artist's music, or find ways to underscore them. Like, to me, adding a certain power to the rhythm section in a song like that is really, it's a very interesting contradiction in terms that it creates this sense of contrast,
right?
Which I personally think helps make the song more complex in a way where it touches people more. I think that if you take a song like that, that's prettier, I suppose, than the other material around it, and you kind of say, okay, this is a pretty song, so I guess you got to understate everything. you aren't really taking full advantage of the power that production can wield.
Right.
And there's an infinite number of ways, I think, to be able to do that. I'm not saying that the way I approached it is the ultimate and best way that song could have been produced, but it definitely helped enhance the end result. And, obviously that's the important thing.
Most definitely. So, a record when I knew that I was going to be talking to you, that I was like, oh man, I have so many, I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to try to keep them to a minimum. You worked on Untouchables, which is, again, a very interesting record in the landscape of Korn's discography. It's one that I've grown to love because I think it truly is I don't know if rock opera is the word I want to use, but there's so many cinematic type elements going on throughout it. Little things happening, especially when you have either a good sound system or really good headphones, that you're able to pay attention to all the minute details of everything that has been put into that. Almost like there is nothing on that record that I don't feel like was just thrown in there because, hey, fuck it, let's do that. It's like, no, it's there for a reason. And the thing that I first want to say is, at the time, I believe it was one of the most expensive records ever recorded. So what was it like having the distinction working on one of the most expensive records at the time? Because Chinese Democracy hadn't come out at that point.
No, it was pretty expensive. I mean, at that point, I'd worked on 2 records that were like ridiculously expensive. Thankfully, both those records were couped. But that didn't make it any easier to wear that to wear that mantle. When we were making that record, I really wasn't thinking of it in those terms. I realized at a certain point that the costs were just spiraling way out of control, and there were aspects about it that couldn't really have been reined in at that point, because even before I got started, the band tacked $1 million worth of expenses, their own expenses, onto the production costs.
Right.
Which I essentially had to accept that contractually if I wanted to work on the project. So already I was coming in like $1 million short. And when the smoke cleared, I think the production budget was up around $1.7 million or something like that, which, I mean, even in the best of circumstances would be an exorbitant amount to spend on a record. But I think the final cost for the record was $3.2 million. And all the rest of that were band expenses. So I don't know exactly what a lot of that money got spent on, because I was never actually permitted to see any of the expense documentation or accounting. But it was, it was definitely a bit hair-raising, but at the same time exhilarating, because we basically had a blank check to do whatever we wanted with. And having those kinds of resources, especially for a band who at that point really didn't have a clear idea of what their direction was going to be, it did wind up helping. I don't think that we could have done that same record, in a shorter amount of time. It just wouldn't have worked out. There were so many layers to get through. For one thing, the band, just being in California, had so many distractions. And they are extremely talented, but they also have the most incredible case of collective ADHD I've ever seen. So, it wasn't easy keeping them focused. Obviously, once we got into a recording studio, things went pretty well. But, trying to work with them in the pre-production and the songwriting phase was difficult. It was a lot of hard work. And it just took a long time. As a matter of course, plus at that point, they were one of the biggest bands in the world. They could have anything that they wanted. They could spend as much money as they had access to whatever they could possibly imagine or think that they needed at that point. So I think they were pretty pampered as well, So if we were going to get anything if we were going to get anything extraordinary out of them, it was going to take a tremendous amount of effort. But fortunately, they gave 100%, so it worked. I think it bore itself out.
What were when you got the demos and kind of getting into the pre-production phase of this record, were the songs kind of already there, or was there a lot of work to get them shaped to be how you would hear them on the record itself when it's all done? Because I've always thought that there's a lot of interesting things done on this record that they haven't really done even prior to this, and not necessarily since either. So I wasn't sure how much of that was because of you working with them, with Jonathan kind of coming off Queen of the Damned and thinking more on a bigger spectrum of filling out all the soundscapes that could be possible. So and there's just kind of an interesting storm of a lot of things around here that I've kind of always wondered about this record.
Well, I can start out by saying that the pre-production on this record took 7 months, if that gives you any indication. As far as Queen of the Damned, Jonathan didn't really have any hand in composing the songs per se.
Okay.
His involvement is almost always at the end. I mean, there were a couple of songs that he wrote on his own, like Alone I Break, which is actually one of my favorite tracks on the record. But he, his involvement would come once the song was actually completed. What I got when I started working with these guys was a CD with 40 tracks on it. The first 2 tracks, I think it was the first 2, were the only pieces of music on the whole thing that resembled completed songs. The second one was the only one that had 3 sections in it. None of them had vocals. And basically that was supposed to be the beginning of the record. I listened to it a couple of times, and I decided that there was absolutely nothing on the CD at all that was of value. And I said to them, we really have to start from scratch here, guys. Like, we don't have the basis for a record here at all. And, we spent months, which culminated in us actually leaving Southern California because the distraction level was far too high for them, and going to Arizona and spending 3 months in Arizona in a writing and pre-production phase. And that's where the balance of the music got written. And we were able to go into a recording studio from there. But yeah, that took a long, long time. Yeah. And it was a lot of work.
I think that was the thing that always, as a fan, again, going back to, I think this record came out in like 2002, so like my senior year at high school, it's like, all we had were magazines and such. The internet was in its infancy stage, so we didn't have this constant access to keep up with everybody, or Twitter or so forth, where people are like, hey, I'm in the studio, here's a little snippet of what we're doing. So it just 4 years between issues, and then we get Untouchables, and it just was like, and then when you finally get it, you're like, wow, okay, like this is really interesting. Like, just it's a completely different band than I've heard, and sonically it just sounds so massive. And I, looking back too, I was trying to think of, I was trying to think of when the shift from kind of more analog recording to digital recording kind of took place, and I was trying to figure out, in retrospect now even, was this kind of at the beginning stages of that kind of starting to happen, or had this already gone digital at that point?
That record is full digital. Okay. I've listened to all their other records, and I think that there are some aspects of them that are fantastic, particularly from the material standpoint, but I never felt that sonically that their records were saying a whole lot, which was really interesting to me, because like, this is a band that have such a unique sound that I felt that it had never really been captured in a way where there was anything signature about it. So my intention on that record was to do something that was going to be much, much different and much more full range, if you want. In terms of its recording. So instead of relying on anything that was tried and true, we just sort of dove into, the bleeding edge of technology. And, I wanted to work in a very high sample rate. So I think we were the first rock record to actually record at 96K, which at that point, even Pro Tools, which is sort of like the established recording format now, they didn't have a 96K recorder. They went up to 48, and there was only one system. There was only one actual, I guess, standalone system in the world that could, maybe more than one, but they weren't very popular, that could do this. And we had to rent these. We had to rent this like enormous clunky thing to this Euphonics R1 recorder, but the technology was really new. I mean, no one was working like this, and but the thing is that I wanted something that was going to be as hi-fi as possible, where you could have a massive. I don't want to use the word wash because wash kind of implies a blur. I wanted to create I did want to create something that would be more symphonic, more orchestral, where you could hear that there was this I guess a wall, wall of tonal instruments and harmonic instruments that were coming at you, that were very fast, which is what the digital recording technology helps replicate, the speed of stuff, right? Because it's much faster in terms of reproduction than analog. But also that there would be a kind of clarity that you wouldn't expect from things that are that distorted. That you would be getting something completely different. So it would be a totally different kind of oral experience. So in this universe, everything is humongous.
Yeah, no, it really is.
And when I started listening to the way the guitars and the bass kind of work together, it sort of reminded me of this like gargantuan, like this huge pipe organ at the center of hell or something like that. And I love that image so much. Like it gave me goosebumps actually. And but it was again to like help make this record into a really powerful emotional experience, and to wield the production in a way where it's actually, again, helping transmit the artist's idea instead of just trying to faithfully record what's there, which frankly I think there are a lot of people can do very, very well, but it's not saying a whole lot. I mean, it's resting on the laurels of what you've got, which in some cases is quite a bit, because some artists are very talented, but in this case I wanted it to be something more where you're kind of like, you're creating like a hyper real sort of experience, something that's more like Sensorend, if you remember that.
Vaguely I remember that. The thing that was also kind of interesting about this record is almost in stark contrast how fast the band put out the next record, and almost went completely 180 in the opposite direction, from having this very bombastic, full-sounding record to kind of something very lo-fi and raw, I guess. And doing it like a year later. Was it kind of interesting from your perspective to see the next record come together so quickly and be put out and how it sounded?
Oh, I have to be perfectly honest. I never heard it.
Okay.
I never heard it. It was, I think I fell into that camp of people where, I don't wind up being a fan of a lot of the artists that I work with. And it's not because I think their music is bad. It's just because I never considered myself like, I can't say that now, I suppose, but since I started out like doing more R&B type stuff and even hip hop, I never considered myself like a rock music fan per se.
Right.
So it wasn't the type of thing where where I've worked with these people, now I'm a fan. In fact, it would be just the opposite. I've worked with these people and I put so much effort into the work that we did that getting near that or anything else that they do actually makes me feel kind of jittery, and I don't like that feeling. So my identification with them in that case is much different than a fan's would be, because I have hands-on experience with them. My experience of their music is tied up in my experience of working with them, which is really, even at this point, kind of indistinguishable. So, it's interesting though, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I mean, like I said, I know nothing per se about production. Like if you were to hand me stuff, I'd be like, I don't know how to do any of that, and hertz and frequencies and all that. Like I don't understand how to actually do it. But I do feel I have an ear for, like, when I listen to it, it's like, oh, there's this cool thing, or oh, it was really interesting how this person panned this part back and forth, and how it creates this kind of interesting effect. Just the little, like, again, the word of the podcast, I guess, is nuance. The nuances sometimes are what keeps me coming back as a listener and keeps a record fresh even after you've heard it 100 times, where you notice little things. And to me, I think that's something that has always been omnipresent on a lot of your records, is there's just little things that always bring you back, whether it be just the great songs themselves that you're able to capture on record, or the production aspect of things. Like you said, like Coma White, like there's the things you did with the drums and so forth that take that song and make it something I want to listen to for an hour and a half straight and not get bored with it.
Well, what's the saying? God is in the details.
Yeah. So kind of getting off of, the records that you've done and kind of more to the effect of why you're actually here, you just recently started, and I don't know if there's a specific date of when this started, but basically you're starting a business of sorts to kind of address the changing industry climate we have in the music industry, I guess, is for lack of a better term. A lot of people now don't have the budgets that they used to have. The 3 point whatever $1 million budgets don't exist. No. And a lot of people are starting to go more do it yourself and being able to buy quality products and put them in their homes. So you have this new business for song analysis and pre-production. What made you want to do this now, and what exactly is the goal for it ultimately?
Well, I began to see over time that artists didn't even know what pre-production is, which, as you can tell by speaking with me, is something that I feel figures very heavily into the creation of a record, especially now. And I was also noticing that, I guess simultaneously, the quality of the records that people were making was starting to decrease drastically. That could be a post hoc fallacy, as people call it. That you kind of see something happening and you see something else happening. That was happening previously, so you blame the decline, the effect of the first thing that you're noticing on the thing that was happening before it. But I do feel that there's a very strong parallel, because I know what a record will be like if it doesn't have pre-production versus what it will be like if it does have pre-production. And not having pre-production can be pretty disastrous, especially if we're talking about an artist who has tremendous potential. It's still going to be very difficult for them to be able to ascertain whether or not their songs are working. But when you actually have potential and you've had an opportunity to delve into your music and you realize that stuff isn't doing what you want it to do and you can't quite figure out what it is, if you don't have the opportunity to work on that and to bring out the potential of what's there, you can in many ways be destroying your music. There's no nice way to put it.
It's very true.
And so my feeling was that, realizing, of course, that pre-production is hard to come by even for people who have recording budgets, that there had to be a way to be able to service people who need that kind of attention to their music, who need that kind of help. And that's where the whole idea came from, how to be able to provide this in a way that's, relatively cost-effective for people. Well, actually completely cost-effective for people and completely accessible by people, who need it.
No, I think that makes perfect sense. And I couldn't agree more that it seems like sometimes people don't take the time when it comes to recording stuff. I think something I've kind of noticed too in some instances with some bands is like you'll hear a record and it sounds it sounds okay, but then you go see the band perform the record or some of the songs live, and there's just something about it. It's almost like they've lived with the songs a little bit longer. They kind of figured out how to extend a part or trim the fat off of the song, and then when you hear it live, you're like, huh, I like that song a lot better than I did on the record. And then you kind of realize, like, I wonder if it's because now they weren't in a rush to get in, record it, get done, go back on the road, which is where they're making most of their money in the first place. And then kind of going like, shit, yeah, we probably didn't need to do that chorus like 3 times to extend the song to end it. We could trim it down, cut the bridge down, a couple of bars, and then okay, now here we go. Now here's a really good tight song that doesn't meander a little bit longer than it needs to be. And sometimes I think that is a byproduct of, like you're saying, bands not having the time maybe, or the financial ability to spend time doing pre-production to get the songs worked out as best as they possibly could be.
Well, I have noticed that bands have this mistaken impression that they have to rush to make a record. It's almost as if they believe that the world is waiting for their next record, that the world is not going to be able to continue, or they're not going to be able to earn money and play shows if they don't get this record done in a hurry, which couldn't be further away from the truth. The thing that people tend to forget, and I can't overstress this enough, is that the world is not necessarily waiting for anything at this point except having a good record. And the other thing is that the most important thing is not going to be your next gig. It's going to be what you leave behind, your legacy. And if you're not willing to look at the recording that you make as your legacy, how's it going to matter to anyone else if you're not willing to put that extra time? This is going to be on this earth and available to people well past the point that you stop breathing. Right. Why wouldn't you put everything that you have into making it as great as it can possibly be? But people don't think like this. They think that the record is essentially a device so that they can get more shows to play on a tour, whereas, 15, 20, 30 years ago, it was just the opposite. It was like, we're going to spend as much time and as much money and resources as we possibly can to make this the best record of our lives. You never really thought in terms of like, okay, well, we can just go in and knock this thing out because no one cares anyway. No, people recognized the importance of the recorded version of their musical output, what the recordings would mean to people, because that's the main way that people are going to be able to disseminate an artist's music. It's not from seeing a show. The show's not, if the band has a bunch of cruddy songs, the show's not going to make it that much better anyhow. I mean, they might get a couple of people to see them because, they want to go out on a Saturday night or something like that. But if the songs ain't there, if they haven't been structured well, it's amazing how short-sighted people have become about this stuff. But this is so much more important than I certainly can't. I don't feel that I can overstate it enough.
No, I think there's a quote that you had on the I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I think it was a podcast talking about Super Unknown. And I'm going to kind of paraphrase because I don't remember the exact quote. But basically, we're talking about first time you heard Black Hole Sun. And
yeah.
Basically, it was something to the effect of, within the first few notes, you were just, absolutely stunned. And, it moved you. You had goosebumps. And that was just hearing a song. And I think, obviously that speaks to, like you were saying, the power of a song. And that's what you're going to be remembered by.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a reason why people are still very upset that Chris is gone. Obviously it's a tragedy when anyone has to die, especially the way he did. But he touched so many people. He made such a powerful impact on people. And that particular song had an immense impact on many, many, many people, And I think I feel that artists making records now, they don't value what they're doing enough, to the extent where they could actually see, maybe I could make that same kind of impact in the world with the music that I'm doing, you know. Yeah. And I think it's important that they do. I think it's important that they start putting that kind of pressure on themselves to excel, because the world needs this very, very badly. They need heroes like Chris, you know, who can affect people emotionally and do things that are potentially life-changing for them, because that really is the power of music, you know, the ability to communicate, to transform people, and to make them think differently and see the world differently. And, you know, if a musician or an artist is unwilling to go that far with what they do, they've essentially failed at their potential, you know, what they can really offer the rest of us.
Yeah, that's that Soundgarden record though. It's still. I was listening to it the other day, and I was just like, man, I remember when my dad got this and just being blown away as a kid by it. I knew it was something special about it, but I couldn't quite grasp it. And now, you know, over 20 some odd years later, it's like it's just phenomenal. Like just that record. Kind of in wrapping up though, because we're going way over what I was expecting. As a producer yourself, what is one of your favorite records from a production standpoint that inspires you every time you hear it to be like, fuck, I want to go into a studio and I want to make a record as good as this?
Oh man, there's so many records that I think would fall under that heading. I mean, a lot of the later Beatles records do that, even though I would ever try and approximate what they did. I mean, obviously they were using like Stone Age technology, which funnily enough, people try and do now to make records sound more retro, which I think is a complete waste of time, but that's just me. You know, like, oh God, I mean, there's such a breadth of material, of recorded music out there where the production has played such an incredible role in communicating what the artist was trying to say. I mean, pick a Led Zeppelin record. Of course, the producer was also the guitarist, you know, and that's one of those rare cases where, you know, where self-production actually worked. You don't see that happen very often.
No.
Damn. That's a really tough question to answer. There's so many of them. Okay. There's just a lot of great producers, and their work is, you know, is stellar.
With all of the various types of bands, and I mean, you've covered everything from, you know, we'll call it grunge to acoustic punk, I guess, and Violent Femmes to, I mean, you even worked with the Bronx, which is another one of my favorite bands. But with all the various bands that you have worked with, what's someone that you haven't worked with that you really would like to?
Band-wise, or just stylistically?
Either or.
I honestly, I've never really taken production from the standpoint of artists or genres. I mean, I found that a lot of the projects that I did were things that I kind of collided with, and I like that the appearance of chaos, even though I'm not a believer in chaos. I like. It feels like chaos to me because I don't know what's going to happen next. So I like to remain open to that kind of thing. You know, so and as far as genres go, I like the idea of not, I wasn't really prepared for a lot of the projects that I did. I wasn't prepared musically. So I didn't really have a template worked out, like a real stylistic understanding of what kind of template I would apply to get this record done in the quickest, most efficient manner, which kind of always gives me the opportunity to try things and to do things that I don't think other people would think of. Mm-hmm. To approach it, I guess, from a more open standpoint, as being more of an artist, as opposed to, okay, I'm a record producer and I operate in the rock genre, so to speak. It's just a different mindset, I think. Like I like being open to everything. I think that's the way I operate best. It kind of takes a safety net away in a sense, because you don't know what's going to come down the pike at you, but it makes life more interesting. And I think in the end results speak for themselves.
Yeah, well, yes, they do.
Huh.
Well, that was pretty much everything I had for you. Is there anything you wanted to add that we didn't touch on at all?
No. I thought that was great. Thank you.
Yeah. Where can everyone find you or your? I don't know if there's socials or a website to go to for those that might be interested in reaching out to you to have song analysis done or the pre-production work done with you.
Yeah, I got a website. It's very simple, michaelbeinhorn.com.
That is very easy to remember.
Yeah, it couldn't be easier.
And I would assume all the socials are just like a tree link on that, take you to all those as well.
Yeah, exactly. I'm pretty findable on social media as well.
Well, thank you again for taking the time to talk to me for about an hour over some of the classic records that you've worked on and all of that. Definitely a pleasure on my end. Thank you very much for the time.
Well, thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
So that was my long conversation with Michael Beinhorn, legendary producer who has worked on such records as Mechnical Animals, Untouchables, and, something I wanted to pose to you, Dan. We haven't really talked about this episode yet. So the interesting thing about this, and something I don't think I've actually asked you, was, with that Korn Untouchables record, I had you, myself, Lauren Kozlowski from Roach Coach Podcast, all were on this thread of Korn stuff after I picked up Untouchables on vinyl. And I said, now my collection's complete. And I think Lauren asked if I had taken a look at yourself in the mirror, and I said no. That's basically where I stopped listening to the band. Like, I kind of fell off after that. And he had made the comment, and he goes, oh, well, it's sad because that's got arguably one of the best Korn songs, which is Did My Time. And I don't think I've mentioned any of this to you because I haven't talked about this interview with you yet, but, I wanted to pose this to you. At one point, I remember reading in a Guitar World magazine that Monkey and Head were trying to figure out where the song came from when they were asked about it, because it sounds different from any Korn song, really, that had been out at the time. And I forget which one of them said this, but they had made the comment that, oh, well, that riff actually came from the last record, but the producer said that the song wasn't good. And it's funny that, we have someone like Lauren who, spends a lot of time in the nu metal trenches saying, that's probably arguably Korn's best song on a kind of record. But it's funny that, something that was so big and a massive hit for those guys, Michael, from what Monkey and Head said in an interview many, many years ago, that it wasn't a good song.
I mean, he wasn't wrong. It wouldn't have been a good song for Untouchables.
No, that's definitely true.
Totally different vibe. So I'm going to still give point to the producer on that one.
You've gotten to talk to Toby Wright, and
that was magical.
I would love to have him on this show too. Do you find that with talking to producers that you find that they're more in the right on a lot of the things that make these albums or songs so great? Or do you think those things would have come out of those musicians and those people regardless of who was behind the boards?
I think that's a tough question, John, because that really depends heavily on the individuals involved. I would say in the case of a Toby Wright, yeah, I mean, just look at his track record of just producing hit album after hit album after hit album after hit album. And it's not even that he was resorting to the same tricks on each one. He was just playing off of the strengths of each artist. And so I think in a case like a Toby Wright, I think he had a lot to do with it. I don't think he was solely responsible. He didn't pick up the guitar and write it himself. But the interesting thing is, after reading Jared Montague's book from Taproot, in his talking with Toby Wright and his dealings with, Toby just wants a good album.
Right.
Like from the offset. It's not necessarily about the legacy of the band or any of that stuff. He just takes it on himself to put out the best sounding album, which actually resulted in him basically telling Jared, hey man, if you can't play drums better, I'm going to call somebody that can.
Which is something that Michael actually did, much to the detriment of Hole putting it in their contract before they even went to go work with Michael. Like, hey, you can't fire our drummer.
Right, yeah, because it's that's rough because you talk to this big name producer and you're like, this is what this is what we need, and I think a lot of the time the producer is looked at by the band and the label as, this guy's going to be your helper. He's going to be a temporary part of the team that's going to help you, blah 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 blah. But you get producers in there that actually know what they're doing, and they're like, look, here's the shit that you guys are doing badly. We're going to avoid all that,
right,
from here on out. And so, yeah, I mean, I think with Toby Wright, I think one of the questions that we asked him was, what's the most important thing, writing it in studio or like hashing it out beforehand? Pre-production, I think, was the actual word used. And he's like, oh my God, pre-production. And that's pretty damn accurate.
No, and that's exactly why we had Michael on, is because, he's got this new platform, which if you go to michaelbeinhorn.com, you'll be able to get more information on this. If you are someone who maybe wants to figure out what your songs are lacking from a legendary producer who has worked with some of the best musicians in the world and put out some of the classic records of the last 20, 30 years, I think this is a really interesting platform. And just really something that's interesting about living in 2019 now, the fact that you have access to Michael Beinhorn. Like, if you would have told me in 2003, 4, you know what, you can go have help from this guy, I'd be like, you're out of your fucking mind. There's no way I can afford that.
Yeah. Yeah, and with the industry changing, a lot of the time, this is the way these producers are able to get their name out there again.
Yeah.
Not that their name wasn't out there before, but they've already got a great resume from when the industry was thriving, and now it's one of those like, hey, you can get an expert opinion, and that honestly is a good way for him to find work because he can handpick the people that he thinks are the best and contact them and get something going. Because it's not that the business practices of the music industry have led to its demise, but as far as the actual qualifications of the people that were working for them. No, like these producers are still great, and you could benefit heavily, especially when you're probably, if you're a new band or whatever, or a new pop artist or whomever, most of your shit starting out's going to be pretty DIY.
Right.
So to have somebody that spectacular, on the line that can give you constructive advice, I mean, it's like a fucking meal ticket.
Yeah, I wish I was more musically inclined and or had a band to take advantage of such an opportunity, but I definitely notice it's a trend that I'm seeing a lot of bigger producers starting to do. I don't think that they're getting bored with the work that they're doing, but I think they want to find those unsung, unpolished talents and help be a part of something that gets them excited about music again from the ground up. But this interview was kind of long, so we're going to kind of wrap this up. If you would like to keep up with Michael, you can go to michaelbeinhorn.com and see everything that he's been doing, get more information on his pre-production and all that kind of stuff. And if you're interested, reach out to him. If you would like to find him on Facebook, you can. It's just under his name. And simple enough. His name is how you find him on Instagram and Twitter. So just Michael Beinhorn, and you'll find him one way, shape, or another. If you would like to keep up with Metal Nexus, you can find them at metalnexus.net. Facebook is Metal Nexus, Instagram is metal.nexus, and Twitter is metal_nexus. And Dan, where can people find you?
Oh, man, you can find me on Twitter at DiscussMetalDan. You can find me on Facebook on Daniel Terry. And you can find my other podcast, Discography Discussion, at DiscussMetal.com.
And if you would like to keep up with the podcast, you can find us on Facebook at Brewtally Speaking. Twitter and Instagram are simply BrewSpeakPod. And if you would like to email us, you can email us at BrewtallySpeaking. You can email us at BrewtallySpeaking@gmail.com. And if you would like to follow our show sponsor, you can find The Bean Bastard at TheBeanBastard.com. Facebook and Instagram are simply The Bean Bastard. Without further ado, that is going to wrap it up for the Brewtally Speaking podcast. I am John.
And I'm Dan.
And we will talk to you guys next time.